You're kneeling in sand that burns through your skin. The iron collar bites so deep into your throat you can taste metal with every breath. You're chained to 11 other women, some sobbing, one praying in words you've never heard, another so silent you think she might already be dead inside. Then a shadow falls across your face. Not relief, not mercy. Just a man's hand grabbing your jaw like your livestock at market. Before we go any deeper, I need to know where in the world you're watching this from. Drop it in the comments. It still amazes me that a story this deliberately buried can reach people across continents centuries later. That woman kneeling in the sand, she was real. Her name is lost now. Her village, somewhere in the Sahel region of West Africa, no longer exists. 12 days ago, she woke up as the daughter of a chief. She had a mother who sang to her. She had a future. Now she has a word in Arabic that defines her new existence: Jaria, slave girl. But that translation is too clean. What it really means is that her body has become currency. Her future belongs to whoever pays the most. Her past has been declared irrelevant. This is a story about 14 million people, a machine that ran for 1,300 years longer than most empires, older than many nations. It moved more human beings across greater distances than almost any forced migration in history. And it was so effective at erasing the people it consumed that today, almost no descendants remain to tell what happened. You know about the Atlantic slave trade. 12 million Africans transported to the Americas over 4 centuries. That history has museums, monuments, movies, school curriculums, political speeches. Descendants who number 45 million strong, whose very existence keeps the memory alive and demands the world never forget. But there was another trade. It started earlier in the 7th century, just decades after the rise of Islam and the Arab conquests sweeping across North Africa. It lasted longer officially, ending only in 1962 in Saudi Arabia, in 1981 in Mauritania. These aren't ancient dates. These are years your grandparents remember. There are people alive right now who were born into societies where this system still operated legally. Between 650 AD and 1900. Somewhere between 14 and 17 million Africans were taken from their homes and transported to the Middle East, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Some historians argue the true number is high. Records were inconsistent. Deaths often went undocumented. Entire caravans disappeared into deserts without anyone counting the bodies left behind. More people, over a longer span, through routes that crossed 3 continents. Yet walk through Cairo, Baghdad, Damascus, Riyadh today, and ask where the descendants of those 14 million went. You'll find almost nothing. Scattered communities in Yemen, a few thousand Afro-Arabs in Morocco, small populations in southern Iraq, tiny remnants where there should be millions. Where did 14 million people go? The answer to that question is the darkest part of this story. And it starts with what the traders did to the men. The caravans didn't capture people themselves. Arab merchants were businessmen, not raiders. They created economic systems that made it profitable for Africans to capture and sell each other. Guns flowed into the continent. European firearms, traded through Arab middlemen. Textiles, luxury goods, salt, which was precious in sub-Saharan regions. In exchange, human beings. The kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now Benin, built its entire economy on annual slave raids against neighboring peoples. The Sultanate of Zanzibar controlled the East African routes. The Funj Sultanate of Sudan dominated the Nile corridor. Various Tuareg groups controlled trans-Saharan passages. African kingdoms waged war not for territory, but for human merchandise. The cycle fed itself endlessly. More guns meant more successful raids. More captives meant more purchasing power. More purchasing power meant more guns. Villages were attacked at dawn when resistance was weakest. Warriors surrounded settlements while people slept. The assault came sudden and overwhelming, which Men who fought were killed immediately. Men who surrendered were evaluated on the spot age, health, strength. Young, strong men were separated for a specific purpose. Older men with no market value were frequently killed where they stood, but the women faced different calculations entirely. Traders examined them with clinical precision. Age mattered enormously. Girls too young would require years of feeding before becoming useful. Women too old had diminished value. The ideal range was roughly 13 to 25, old enough to survive the brutal journey ahead, young enough for decades of use. Physical appearance affected price dramatically. Arab markets had specific preferences that experienced traders knew intimately. Ethiopian women commanded premium prices across almost all markets. Their features were considered particularly desirable. They might sell for double or triple what women from other regions brought. The separation of families happened at the capture sites. Mothers torn from children, husbands from wives, sisters from brothers. The bonds of a lifetime severed in moments with no hope of reunion. European missionaries who witnessed these scenes left accounts that haunted them for decades. One wrote that no matter how far he traveled or how much time passed, he could still hear the mothers calling for their children's screams that followed him across oceans and years. Those screams echoed across Africa for 13 centuries. Almost no one in the outside world heard them. Then came the journey that sorted the living from the dead. Picture the distance from New York to Denver. Now imagine walking it in chains with almost no water under a sun that kills. The trans-Saharan route stretched over 1,500 miles, sometimes 2,000. The journey took 2 to 3 months under optimal conditions. Conditions were never optimal. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth. Daytime temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sand becomes so hot it blisters skin on contact. Shade doesn't exist for hundreds of miles. Then night falls and the temperature plummets. The same desert that broiled you during the day drops below freezing after dark. The temperature swing alone killed countless people. Water was rationed with brutal calculation. Camels needed water to survive. Camels were expensive. Camels carried goods. Slaves were cheaper than camels. Slaves were replaceable. So slaves received whatever water remained after the animals drank. Lips cracking until they bled, tongues swelling. The maddening knowledge that there was nothing to drink and hundreds of miles of burning sand still ahead. Food was minimal dried dates, sometimes grain, enough calories to keep legs moving, but never enough to maintain health over months of walking. The mortality rates were catastrophic. Historians estimate 20 to 30% of slaves died during Saharan crossings. Some caravans lost half their human cargo. There are accounts of caravans arriving with more than 60% losses. Those who collapsed were left where they fell. Stopping to bury bodies would slow the caravan. Stopping to help the dying might mean losing the living. The economics didn't support compassion. People were abandoned alive, too weak to walk further left, sitting in the sand as the caravan moved on, waiting to die. Heinrich Barth, a German explorer who crossed the Sahara in the 1850s, documented what he witnessed. The road was literally strewn with human skeletons. In some valleys, the bones were so numerous that one could hardly avoid stepping on them. Skulls bleached white by the sun, rib cages half buried in drifting sand. René Cayley documented similar horrors on western Roots valleys that appeared white from a distance, not from sand, but from accumulated bones. Gustav Natztegal wrote of passing through regions where skulls and bones gave the sand an almost pavement-like quality underfoot. Hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions over 13 centuries. Their remains scattered across the world's largest desert, marking the paths that swallowed them. Silent testimony to a trade the world chose to ignore. For the women who survived, who somehow endured the heat and cold and thirst and starvation. Arrival at a North African port meant only that the immediate dying had stopped. Their ordeal was transforming into something else. The slave markets of the Arab world were ancient institutions refined over centuries. Cairo's market had operated continuously for over 1,000 years by the time European observers began documenting it. Generation after generation of traders had perfected the practices, the pricing, the techniques of evaluation. Buyers came from across the Islamic world and beyond. Ottoman nobles from Constantinople, Persian merchants from Isfahan, wealthy Arabs from Damascus and Baghdad, traders from the Gulf states seeking domestic servants. Even European buyers, despite official prohibitions, found ways to participate. The markets were organized by category. Common laborers in one section, skilled workers in another, domestic servants in a third, and behind screens in the most exclusive areas the women intended for private sale. The examination process was systematic and thorough. Teeth first, dental health indicated age and remaining years of useful life. Then skin, examined for disease, scars, imperfections, hair checked for texture and length. Then the rest. Buyers paying premium prices demanded thorough evaluation. One British observer in the 1830s wrote, "The women are made to walk, to turn, to display themselves in ways that cannot be described in polite company. The buyers examine them as a horseman examines a mare with identical cold calculation and complete absence of human feeling." Zanzibar became the largest slave market in the Indian Ocean world. At its peak, 50,000 slaves passed through annually. The island's entire economy revolved around human merchandise. David Livingstone witnessed the trade firsthand. What he saw changed him forever. He wrote, "To overdraw its evils is simply impossible. The subject does not admit of exaggeration. The sights I have seen are so revolting that I always strive to drive them from memory." The market operated openly until 1873, when British pressure forced its closure. The Sultan signed a treaty. The auctions officially ended, but the trade continued underground for decades afterward. Ships sailed at night. Transactions happened in hidden locations. Where there is demand, supply finds a way. Where did these women go after they were sold? The wealthiest buyers were building harems. Ottoman sultans maintained harems with hundreds of women, sometimes thousands. The imperial harem at Topkapi Palace in Constantinople held up to 2,000 women at various points in history. Lesser nobles and provincial governors kept smaller collections proportional to their wealth. The harem was more complex than the word suggests today. It wasn't merely about physical gratification. It was a political institution where women competed for favor. Bearing a son to a powerful man could mean everything. The mother of a future sultan wielded enormous power. So women schemed, formed alliances, undermined rivals. Poison was common. For a captured African woman, entering a harem meant systematic erasure of everything she had been. She received a new name. Her language was forbidden. Her religion was replaced. Her past was destroyed and rebuilt. Trainers taught her new customs, behaviors, expectations, how to walk, how to serve, what was permitted and punished. Eventually, nothing remained of who she had been. Some women navigated this successfully. A rare few achieved genuine power. Kaksım Sultan dominated Ottoman politics for decades. She began life as a slave girl captured from a Greek village. Harem Sultan became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, an almost unheard-of achievement for a former slave. But these were exceptions so extraordinary that history records their names precisely because they were unusual. For every Kaksım, thousands lived and died anonymous, used until no longer useful, then discarded. Women sold to less wealthy buyers faced different circumstances. Many became domestic servants with additional obligations. They cooked, cleaned, raised children, and submitted whenever their owner desired. There was no concept of consent. No option to refuse. Islamic law technically provided some protections for slave women who became mothers. A slave who bore her master's child was called walad, mother of a child. She couldn't be sold afterward. Her child was born legally free. When her master died, she would gain her freedom. But these protections required enforcement. Reality was inconsistent, and protections only applied after pregnancy. Before that, she was property. Children born from these unions were legally free, often acknowledged. Some achieved prominence. Multiple sultans were sons of slave mothers. But the mothers remained slaves unless explicitly freed. Over generations, these children married into Arab populations. Their features blended. Their African heritage diluted with each new generation until it became invisible. Until it vanished completely. This was the final erase, not just of individuals, but of their descendants. Not just of lives, but of any evidence those lives had ever existed. But we haven't answered the other question yet, the one about the men. The men were castrated. This is not theory. This is documented across hundreds of primary sources spanning multiple centuries. Arab slave traders systematically castrated African males at rates between 80 and 90%. The procedure was performed at specific points along the trade routes. Egyptian monasteries became notorious for it. Coptic Christian monks developed techniques that slightly improved survival rates. Slightly. For every man who survived castration, somewhere between 3 and 5 died from blood loss, infection, or shock. Some sources suggest even higher mortality. Think about that math. If a trader needed 100 living eunuchs to sell at market, he might start with 400 or 500 men. The rest died screaming in the sand. The economics were brutal but logical. Castrated slaves couldn't reproduce, couldn't form families, couldn't create communities that might grow strong enough to resist, couldn't leave descendants who might one day demand freedom. They worked, they aged, they died, and they were replaced with fresh captives from the next raid. Generation after generation for 1,300 years. The Arab slave trade didn't end with a dramatic abolition. There was no Emancipation Proclamation. No civil war fought over it. No moment when the world rose up and declared it finished. Instead, it faded slowly, reluctantly, under external pressure rather than internal moral awakening. British naval power gradually closed East African routes in the late 1800s. The Royal Navy actively hunted slave ships. Colonial administrations suppressed trans-Saharan trade as European powers carved up Africa. International pressure forced formal abolitions throughout the 20th century. But the legacy isn't monuments or memorials. The legacy is absence. In the Middle East today, there are virtually no descendants of the 14 million taken there. The men were castrated. The women's children were absorbed into Arab populations. Their heritage diluted until it disappeared. The victims vanished so completely that most people don't know they existed. No movies have been made about them. No holidays commemorate their suffering. No politicians give speeches in their memory. In 2020, archaeologists in Libya discovered a mass grave, hundreds of remains. Analysis revealed they were sub-Saharan Africans who died in the 18th or 19th century, almost certainly slaves who never finished the crossing, who collapsed and were left behind while the caravan moved on. They had no names in any record, no descendants to claim them. No one anywhere in the world who remembered they had ever lived, just bones in the desert. The Atlantic slave trade left 45 million descendants who ensure history is never forgotten. The Arab slave trade left silence. 14 million people erased so completely we don't have their names. That woman in the market, the one whose teeth were examined, whose body was evaluated, whose humanity was stripped away one inspection at a time, we will never know what she was called before they took her name. The name her mother gave her. The name her village knew her by. She might have ended up in a Cairo harem competing with dozens of other women for scraps of attention from a man who owned her. She might have ended up in a Baghdad household cooking and cleaning and submitting whenever called. She might have ended up in a palace in Istanbul, forgotten in a corner when her youth faded. She might have borne children who never learned her original language, who never heard her songs, who never knew her stories or where she came from. She might have died in the desert, her bones joining millions of others, marking the roots that civilization has tried to forget. What we know is that she existed. She suffered. She endured things no human being should ever endure. And for 1,300 years, millions like her fed a machine designed to consume them completely. The Atlantic slave trade has monuments, museums, memorials, days of remembrance. This history has sand-covering bones that no one will ever identify. Remember her not as a number, not as a statistic. Remember her as someone's daughter, someone who laughed once, someone who had a name before they erased it. That's the only memorial these 14 million will ever receive.